Some secrets don't hide in shadows. They hide in plain sight, dressed in loyalty, speaking the right words, standing on the wrong side of the right heart. I hope you'll have a wonderful time. The candles in the Hogwarts library burned lower after midnight. Hermione knew this the way she knew the weight of her own wand, not from reading about it, not from anyone telling her, but from years of sitting in their dying light long after the last student had shuffled out and Madame Pince had locked the front gate with a sound like a whispered threat. The flames shrank to amber threads, barely enough to read by, but she had never needed much light for what she did in those hours. She had memorized the words long before she opened the books. Tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't reading. She sat at the table furthest from the entrance, the one tucked behind the restricted section's iron gate, where the shadows pooled thick as ink, and she stared at the folded square of parchment in front of her. It sat between her hands like a sleeping thing, like something that breathed. The wax seal pressed into its surface was not red, not gold, not any colour that belonged to her world. It was silver grey, the precise shade of a sky 3 minutes before a storm breaks, and pressed into it was the unmistakable outline of a serpent curled around a wand. She had not opened it. She had been not opening it for 47 minutes. The thing was, she knew what was inside. She had written half of it herself, or rather, she had provided the information that would become half of it, passed through 3 separate intermediaries over the course of 2 weeks, each exchange so carefully choreographed that not even Ron, who noticed very little outside of Quidditch and food, had registered anything unusual in her behaviour. She had been impeccably normal, impeccably Hermione. Textbooks stacked with architectural precision, homework submitted 2 days early, opinions offered loudly and often about ministry corruption and house elf rights, and the importance of constant vigilance. She had performed herself so thoroughly that some mornings she almost believed it. Almost. Her finger moved to the seal, stopped. The edge of the parchment was slightly rough. She could feel the tooth of it against the pad of her fingertip, the way old vellum had a texture that cheap modern paper didn't, as though the words pressed into it carried more weight simply by virtue of the material that held them. "You're being ridiculous," she told herself, in the brisk, internal voice she had cultivated over years of applying logic to situations that resisted it. "You know what it says. Open it and confirm it, and then decide what to do." She opened it. The handwriting inside was not what she expected. She had expected the sharp, economical script of a boy who had been taught penmanship the same way he had been taught everything, as a performance of superiority. Instead, the letters were smaller than usual, compressed, as though the writer had pressed down too hard with the quill and then thought better of it halfway through and tried to take up less space on the page. "The meeting is confirmed. Saturday. The astronomy tower, not the room. The wards there have been compromised. Come alone. Burn this." And then, below the practical instructions, in writing that was smaller still, almost cramped, as though it had been added after a long pause, "I found what you asked about. The thing you said about your parents. There may be a way. I'll bring the text." Hermione read those 2 sentences 4 times. Then she folded the parchment with hands that were perfectly steady. She was very proud of how perfectly steady her hands were. and held it over the nearest candle flame until it caught, curling black at the edges, the silver seal bubbling and splitting. She let it burn down to nothing, let the ash fall onto the stone floor, and then sat in the remnant warmth of her own steady hands, and felt, with a precision that would have alarmed her if she had let it surface fully, something she had no suitable clinical vocabulary for. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too clean for this, too uncomplicated. This was something that had jagged edges, something that had been living under her sternum for 3 years, making itself known only in the spaces between heartbeats, only in the moments when she was most deeply occupied with something else, and her vigilance lapsed. It felt, if she were being honest with herself, and there was no one else in the library, no performance required. It felt like the specific ache of wanting something you have been telling yourself with enormous discipline and conviction that you do not want. She was 14 when it started. She would not have admitted that then. She would not, in fact, admit it to herself until she was well into her 15th year, in a moment of particular exhaustion when the maintenance of her own internal narrative had simply slipped. She had been in the library, because of course she had been in the library. 4th year, 2 weeks after the first task of the Triwizard Tournament, when the school had split itself neatly along loyalty lines, and Harry's name was on every lip, either in worship or contempt. She had been trying to locate a specific text on counterjinxes, running her finger along a shelf of books that were organized by the castle's own idiosyncratic logic, rather than any system Hermione found defensible, when she had turned a corner and found Draco Malfoy sitting on the floor, not standing. Not positioned with the particular elegance that seemed to be built into his posture, the way transfiguration was built into the castle's walls. Just sitting on the stone floor, with his back against the shelves, and his knees drawn up, and a book open on his thighs that he was not reading. She knew he wasn't reading it, because his eyes were focused on the middle distance, about 3 feet in front of him, the fixed, glassy look of someone whose thoughts had gone somewhere the body couldn't follow. She should have left. That was the obvious move. That was the move consistent with who Hermione Granger was. Gryffindor, top of her year, Harry Potter's best friend, person who did not have accidental silent moments with Draco Malfoy in library alcoves. She had stood there for 4 full seconds. She counted them before he looked up. What happened in the next moment was not dramatic. There was no exchange of meaningful glances, no sudden, profound understanding. He looked at her with the habitual slight curl of his lip that served him as a default expression, and said nothing. She looked back with what she hoped was the appropriate level of neutrality, and also said nothing. Then she said, because silence had always been more uncomfortable to her than the wrong words, "You're in my way." He looked down at the floor he was occupying, looked back up. "There's an entire library. I need the books directly behind you." A beat. He studied her face with an attention that she found, to her deep irritation, slightly difficult to maintain eye contact with. Not because of the quality of his gaze, exactly, though it was cooler and more deliberate than most people's. The grey of his irises less like softness, and more like pewter, something forged rather than grown. But because of the faint impression it gave of seeing more than the surface of whatever it was looking at. "Which ones?" he said. This was not the response she had been prepared for. What? Which books? He shifted slightly, turning to look at the shelf behind him without getting up. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes. I've read the spines. Which ones do you need? She told him. Not immediately. There was a pause in which she recalibrated, rapidly, against a version of this conversation she had apparently been having with a different person entirely. She told him the titles, and he reached behind himself without standing, pulled 2 of the 3 from the shelf and held them out to her. She took them. The third one's 2 shelves up, he said, returning to whatever middle distance his thoughts had been inhabiting. On the left, you'll need to reach. She got it herself. She did not say thank you. He did not expect her to. She was almost to the end of the aisle before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was quite level, aimed at the shelf rather than at her retreating back. Granger. She stopped, did not turn. The thing you're looking for, he said, about the counterjinx. The standard texts won't have it. There's a 1912 edition of Practical Defensive Magic in the restricted section. The relevant passage has been cut out of the Hogwarts copy, but the annotation in the margin on the facing page tells you which earlier source it references. It's cross-listed under weatherworking for some reason. 3rd shelf, east wall. Silence. Why, she said carefully, are you telling me that? Another pause. When he answered, his voice had the quality of someone reading from a text they had memorized, but not written. Precise, detached, faintly bored. Because I looked for it last week, and it took me 4 hours to find. You would have spent 4 hours finding it too, and that seems like a waste. She did not thank him then either. She went to the restricted section, found the 1912 edition, found the annotation, found the earlier source, and spent the next hour in a state of low-grade disturbance that she attributed firmly and incorrectly to the lateness of the hour. That had been the beginning. Not of anything she would have called a friendship, not then. Not for a long time after then, in fact. It had been the beginning of something without a category in Hermione's extensive mental filing system, a series of accidental proximate moments in places they both, for different reasons, occupied outside of school hours. The library, a particular alcove near the charms corridor that caught the early light in a way that made reading easier. The hospital wing, once, after a Quidditch incident that had left them both there for different reasons, and with nothing to do for 3 hours, but maintain the careful neutrality of 2 people pretending not to be aware of each other. Slowly, with all the deliberate pace of something neither of them controlled, the encounters had shifted. Information exchanged, observations made, without quite looking at each other. A book recommended. A passage argued over in hushed, sharp voices, while Madame Pince's footsteps echoed somewhere in the next aisle, and the argument mattered more than the need to avoid her notice. By 5th year, Hermione had a secret that she kept with the same exhausting precision she applied to every other aspect of her constructed public self. She understood Draco Malfoy better than she understood most people she called her friends. Not because she agreed with him, not because she excused any of it. The cruelty, the inherited doctrine, the casual use of a word that landed like a blade every time she heard it from his mouth. She didn't excuse it. She carried it alongside the other things she knew about him, the way you carry a difficult text that rewards close reading. with effort and discomfort, and the reluctant acknowledgement that the difficulty does not make it less true. She knew he was afraid. Not of the things he sneered about, failure, poverty, weakness in the obvious sense. He was afraid of the specific gravity of his own inheritance, the way it had closed around him before he was old enough to have chosen it, and the growing private suspicion, never voiced, barely admitted, that what had been pressed into him as certainty was beginning to show, under the pressure of actual lived experience, something more complicated than certainty. She knew this because she had listened in the hours when the library was empty and the performance was suspended, and he forgot occasionally that she was supposed to be beneath his consideration, and said things he would never have said to anyone whose opinion mattered to him in a straightforward way. The parchment ash lay cold on the library floor. Saturday, the astronomy tower. He had found something about her parents. Hermione pressed her fingertips flat against the table and breathed through the ache under her sternum. The jagged, imprecise, completely undeniable thing, and made herself hold very still until the feeling reached a manageable volume. Then she gathered her books, extinguished the last candle with a tap of her wand, and walked back through the darkened library toward the stairs, her footsteps precise and unhurried, her sleeve cuffs perfectly straight. Saturday arrived the way difficult things often did, not with announcement, but with a quiet, inexorable accumulation of hours that brought her closer to it whether she was ready or not. Hermione spent the morning in the common room with Ron and Harry, performing the particular version of herself that required the most maintenance. Relaxed, present, slightly bossy about revision schedules. She corrected Ron's transfiguration essay with red ink and genuine attention to the errors, because the performance only held if it was real in the details. Harry was distracted. He was always distracted that year, pulled inward by something he hadn't yet named out loud, and she watched him from across the table with the specific tenderness she felt for both of them, the kind that had nothing false in it. That was the part that no version of her internal narrative had ever managed to resolve cleanly. She loved them. That was not the performance. Ron's uncomplicated warmth, Harry's particular brand of exhausted courage, these were not things she had invented. The friendship was real. The loyalty was real. What was constructed, what had been constructed with increasing deliberateness over 5 years, was the version of that loyalty that left no room for anything else. The version that said, "This is everything. These two, this cause, this side of a line that runs through the entire world, and you know exactly which side of it you stand on." She had been 11 when the sorting hat pressed itself over her eyes. She had been 11 and terrified, and the hat had gone very quiet on her head for a long moment before it announced Gryffindor to the hall. And in that moment of silence, it had said something to her that she had never repeated to anyone, not because she had been instructed to keep it private, but because she had no framework for what it meant until considerably later. "You are either the bravest Gryffindor I will ever sort," the hat had said, in its dry, knowing voice that seemed to come from inside her own skull, "or you are something more complicated than bravery. Time will tell. Perhaps both." She had assumed for years that it meant her academic ambition, her willingness to argue with teachers, the particular nerve required to exist as a Muggle-born in a world that had very clear opinions about her presence in it. It had not occurred to her until the night in the library with Draco's ash still cooling on the floor that it might have meant something else entirely. She left the common room at 10:30, claiming the library, which no one questioned because no one ever questioned Hermione Granger and the library. She took the longer route to the astronomy tower, up through the charms corridor, left past the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy and his ill-fated trolls, up the narrow staircase that wound through the east wall of the castle, like a thought that couldn't find its conclusion. The stone here was older than in the main corridors. She could feel it in the temperature, in the way the air held still rather than moving, in the particular quality of silence that old stone produced. Not emptiness, but density, as though the quiet had weight. The tower door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped into the circular room at the top, with its wide stone parapet and the enormous, indifferent sky overhead, pale with the particular colourlessness of November. The wind came in from the north with a sharp mineral bite, carrying the scent of approaching rain and the distant, cold signature of the lake. Draco was already there. He was standing at the parapet with his back to the door, his grey uniform robes pulled close, his hands resting on the stone in a way that looked deliberate, as though he had positioned himself with attention to how he would appear when she entered, and then stood there long enough that the deliberateness had worn through to something more genuine. His hair was lighter than it looked in the torchlit corridors, pale almost to whiteness in the flat November light, and he did not turn when she came in. She crossed the room and stood beside him, not too close, leaving the appropriate distance of two people who were not, by any public definition, anything to each other. Below, the grounds spread out in their winter austerity. The black water of the lake, the bare-limbed trees at the forest's edge, the Quidditch pitch with its skeletal hoops rising against the colourless sky. From up here, the castle's ordinary geography fell away, and what remained was something more essential. The sheer improbable fact of the place, stone and magic, and centuries of accumulated human urgency, all of it sitting in a Scottish valley as though it had always been there and always would be. "You burned the note," Draco said, still not looking at her. "You told me to." "I know." A pause. "I just wanted to confirm." She looked at the side of his face. There was a tension in his jaw that she had learned, over the course of 3 years of careful, covert observation, was not anger, but something in the same family as anger. A second cousin, perhaps, related by the way it occupied the same physical space without quite the same heat. Closer to apprehension, held inside a form that didn't permit apprehension to show. "You said you found something," she said. His hands shifted on the stone. She heard it, the faint friction of skin against old parapet, the slight scrape. "I found a text, a theoretical framework mostly, written by a healer in 1943 who specialized in memory modification, specifically in cases of extensive, systematically applied obliviation." He paused. "The kind you performed on 2 specific muggles in August." The wind moved through the space between them. "It's theoretical," he said again, and this time the word carried a different weight, something careful laid inside it. "There are no documented cases of reversal at the scale you're describing. But the theory holds, according to the text," And the healer believed. Before she died, before her research was largely buried by people who preferred not to think too carefully about what extensive memory work does to a person. That systematic application of a counter-sequence, beginning within 2 years of the original modification, had a reasonable probability of Draco. He stopped. She had used his given name. She was aware of this the moment it left her mouth, with the particular clarity of someone who has just crossed a threshold and cannot immediately determine whether the room on the other side is safe. They had been operating for 3 years in a careful register of surnames and clipped neutrality, a language that maintained the necessary fiction of their non-relationship, and she had just stepped outside it without planning to. He had gone very still. "Did it work?" she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of its levelness, given what was happening in her chest. A pressure, a held quality, like a room with all the windows shut before a storm. A beat. "I don't know. Your parents are in Australia. I can't verify the current state of the modification from here." He finally turned to look at her, and she made herself hold the full weight of his gaze without adjusting her expression. The grey of his eyes in this light was not pewter, not the forged quality she remembered. It was closer to winter water, something that moved if you looked at it long enough. "I brought the text. You should read it yourself. You'll understand it better than I do." He reached inside his robes and produced a slim, dark-covered volume, its spine cracked with age, and held it out to her. She took it. Their fingers did not touch. She was aware, with more precision than the situation warranted, of the exact half-inch of space between her hand and his. She opened the book and looked at the first page without reading it. "Why are you doing this?" she said. The question sat in the air. Below them, the lake reflected nothing. Too dark, too still. The first drops of the approaching rain were beginning to make themselves known, small cold points of contact on the exposed stone. Draco looked back toward the grounds. His jaw had that quality again, the not quite anger, the held thing. "You know why. Tell me anyway." Another long pause. The rain began in earnest now, soft and persistent, beginning to darken the stone of the parapet by degrees. He didn't move to avoid it. She didn't either. "Because," he said, with the particular care of someone selecting words the way you'd select footing on uncertain ground, "you gave me the counter-sequence for the tracking ward on the East Corridor 6 months ago. Before I knew why you were giving it to me, before I understood what you were actually—" He stopped. Started again, slightly differently, as though the first path through the sentence had led somewhere he hadn't intended. "You trusted me with something that could have destroyed you, and I didn't use it that way." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." "I want to know," he said. And now the carefully modulated tone slipped, just slightly, just enough. Whether that was a calculation or something else. She looked down at the book in her hands. The tooth of its cover was rough under her fingers, aged leather with the dry, slightly sweet decay of very old bindings. She ran her thumb along the spine and thought, with the particular clarity that cold air and high places produced in her, about the sorting hat's voice in the darkness under its brim. Bravery or something more complicated? "My parents," she said slowly, "are in Brisbane. They believe their names are Wendell and Monica Wilkins. They believe they have always wanted to emigrate. They believe they have a daughter, but she moved away years ago, and they don't think about her much anymore. She paused. The rain was in her hair now, beginning its patient work of soaking through. I did that to them. I did it carefully and thoroughly, and I told myself it was protection, and I have told myself that every day for 4 months and some mornings I almost believe it. She felt him look at her. The tracking ward, she continued, was not a calculation. I gave it to you because keeping it from you was going to get someone killed, and the someone in question was relevant to me. Not in a way I've been able to explain cleanly, even to myself. Silence. The rain. Below, a pair of owls crossed the lake's surface, skimming the water, and she watched them until they disappeared into the tree line. Relevant, Draco repeated. It's the most accurate word I have. She heard him breathe. It was the kind of breath that isn't quite a laugh and isn't quite a sigh, something in the narrow passage between the two that doesn't have its own name. Then he said, very quietly, looking straight ahead at the rain-dimmed grounds, I've been watching you for 3 years. Her thumbs stilled on the book's spine. That's not... He made a sound of controlled frustration and tried again. I mean, I've been watching the way you operate, how you hold things together that should pull apart, how you maintain all of it, all the layers, and they never slip except in moments you've decided no one is observing. A pause, and in it she could feel the atmospheric pressure of what he wasn't saying yet, the dense, charged quality of air before lightning. Except I was observing, and I don't know what to do with what I've seen. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. The rain moved between them, cold and indifferent, and in this particular moment almost tender. His hair was damp, losing its arrangement, and she had a sudden awareness of him, not as the performance, not as Draco Malfoy, prefect, heir, weapon aimed at her world, but as the person who sat on library floors, reading books he wasn't reading, who told her about annotations in restricted texts because 4 hours was a waste, who had held information that could have ended her and had chosen, without apparent calculation, to hold it differently. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was inconvenient and precise. Then perhaps, she said carefully, you should tell me what you've seen. The rain thickened. Neither of them moved toward shelter. His eyes did not leave her face, and she held the look with everything she had, all the discipline, all the years of practiced composure, and felt it, quietly and without her permission, begin to cost her something. He did not tell her that night. The rain made the decision for them, not gradually, but all at once, the way weather in Scotland sometimes chose to, dropping from persistent drizzle to something serious and cold that swept across the tower parapet in visible curtains. Hermione felt it hit her shoulders like a flat hand, and in the same moment, Draco turned from the parapet without a word and moved toward the tower door. And she followed because the alternative was standing in the open in November rain with a very old book that could not get wet. They stood just inside the doorway, not quite sheltered. The wind found the threshold and moved through it, but out of the worst of it. The stone stairwell curved below them in darkness, carrying the hollow echo of the rain on the castle's outer walls. Draco's robes were dark at the shoulders, his hair entirely abandoned to the weather now, and he stood with one hand against the doorframe, looking out at the grey-white sheet of water with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "Thursday," he said. "The alcove off the Charms corridor. The one with the east window." She knew the one. They both knew the one, without having ever explicitly acknowledged knowing it, which had been the nature of their particular grammar for 3 years. "Thursday," she agreed. He left first. She waited 4 minutes. She counted, looking at her watch in the thin light from the doorway, and then descended the stairs alone, the old book tucked inside her robes against her chest, where its worn spine pressed against her sternum with every step like a small, insistent reminder. Sunday she spent in controlled, productive misery. She rewrote her potions essay. She reorganized 3 weeks of arithmancy notes into a cross-referenced index. She had a long, comfortable conversation with Harry about his suspicions regarding Snape. The kind of conversation she had held dozens of times, measured and attentive, where she offered the counter-argument, not because she necessarily believed it, but because Harry needed the pushback to think clearly. She was good at being what people needed her to be. She had always been good at that. In the evening, when the common room had thinned to a handful of fourth years playing Exploding Snap by the fire, she opened the healer's text under the cover of a larger Charms volume and read it slowly, with the full weight of her attention. It was dense, technical, and in places the theoretical framework was built on foundations she would have to research separately to fully evaluate. But the core argument was coherent, and the methodology, where it was outlined, in the careful, hedged language of someone who knew their findings would not be welcomed, was not implausible. The counter-sequence operated on a principle she recognized from advanced memory theory. Not restoration exactly, but re-exposure, a careful, systematic reintroduction of suppressed neural pathways that the modification had rerouted rather than destroyed. The memories weren't gone. They were present, dormant, held in a structure that the modification had built around them, like a room with no doors. The healer believed you could make a door. Hermione read that passage 3 times, with her thumbnail pressed hard against her lower lip and her sleeve cuffs. For once, not straight at all. She thought about her mother's voice, the specific frequency of it, the way it had a warmth that started in the chest rather than the throat. She thought about her father's hands, broad and careful, surgeon's hands, the hands he used to hold books, and also to hold her when she was small enough that his arms went all the way around. She thought about them in Brisbane under names that were not theirs, living a life she had constructed for them out of necessity and love, and a terror so complete it had felt, in the moment of performing the charm, like the most heroic thing she had ever done. She thought about Draco Malfoy's handwriting, pressed smaller than usual on a scrap of parchment, saying, "There may be a way." She closed the book and sat with her hands flat on its cover, and practiced, very deliberately, the technique she had developed in second year for managing feelings of overwhelming magnitude. She named them one by one in precise clinical language, as though she were cataloguing specimens rather than experiencing them. Grief, present, manageable, familiar, fear, operational, not debilitating, hope, dangerous, handle with care, The fourth one she sat with longer, turning it over, examining its edges. It was the most resistant to clinical language, the most inclined to slip out of the taxonomic categories she tried to press it into. It had something to do with a man standing in the rain looking at the grounds, with an expression she couldn't categorize, saying, "I've been watching you," in the careful voice of someone who understood that certain statements, once made, cannot be recalled. She named it, finally, with the reluctant precision of a scientist, confirming a result they had hoped the data wouldn't support. Longing, chronic, likely pre-existing. Then she put it away and went to bed and lay in the dark for a very long time, listening to Lavender Brown's peaceful breathing from across the dormitory and thinking about the specific quality of grey eyes in November rain. Monday and Tuesday passed in the ordinary machinery of school life, which Hermione moved through with the efficiency of long practice. Classes, meals, the performance of herself, well maintained, it seems invisible. She sat across from Harry at breakfast and beside Ron in History of Magic, and laughed at the right moments and corrected the wrong ones, and was, by all observable measures, entirely herself. On Wednesday afternoon, she passed Draco in the corridor outside Transfiguration. He was with Crabbe and Goyle, which was a kind of armour he wore in the public corridors, the bulk of their presence making him smaller by comparison, or perhaps larger, she had never decided which. He was talking at them rather than to them, something about Quidditch strategy, and his voice had the particular flat authority of someone who had learned to command attention without expecting genuine engagement. She was walking with Harry and Ron on her left, and the two groups passed each other in the way they always passed each other. Mutual acknowledgement of mutual contempt, Ron's jaw setting, Harry's eyes going briefly cold, the ritual exchange of a shared glance between her and Draco that lasted less than a second, and communicated in that fraction of time something that would have taken either of them a paragraph to say in words. Tomorrow. She looked away first. She always looked away first. Ferret, Ron muttered once they were past. Don't, she said, which was what she always said, and Ron gave her the look he always gave her, slightly baffled, vaguely affectionate, entirely unaware, and she kept walking with her books held against her chest and her expression perfectly settled. Thursday. The alcove off the Charms corridor was a remnant of an earlier version of the castle's floor plan. A window embrasure that had been widened at some point into a space just large enough for two people to stand or one person to sit on the stone bench below the glass. The window faced east, which in the morning meant a column of pale light that fell across whoever was in it in a way that made the alcove simultaneously visible and, by some trick of the castle's architecture, acoustically isolated from the corridor. Voices didn't carry out of it. Hermione had tested this. She arrived first. She sat on the stone bench and opened a textbook she had no intention of reading and waited with her eyes on the page while the morning light moved incrementally across the floor toward her feet. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. She had learned them over 3 years of unconscious attention, the way they differed from other footsteps in the particular quality of their precision, unhurried but exact, as though each foot were placed with private deliberation. He came around the corner of the corridor, glanced once in both directions with a habit so ingrained it was barely visible as a movement, and stepped into the alcove. The light caught him. She noticed this in the peripheral way she had trained herself to notice things about him, efficiently, without appearing to look. He sat at the other end of the stone bench, which was not very long, and set his bag down between them with the measured placement of a person maintaining an established distance. He did not greet her. She did not greet him. They had never greeted each other. "Did you read it?" he said. "All of it." "And?" She turned a page of the textbook she wasn't reading. "The methodology is sound in principle. The application would require access to my parents, controlled conditions, and a level of technical precision in the counter sequence that goes beyond anything currently taught at school. But possible. Theoretically." She paused. "The healer who wrote it died in 1967. Her research was not published in mainstream journals. Where did you find the text?" A silence, of the kind that with Draco carried more content than most people's speech. She waited it out. "My father has an extensive private library," he said, finally, in a tone that moved through the words the way cold water moves through rock, finding the path of least resistance, wearing the surface smooth without disturbing the structure. "Not everything in it is sanctioned material. He doesn't know I've read most of it. He doesn't know what I've taken from it." She looked up from the textbook. He was looking at the corridor, his profile to her. The light fell across the sharp geometry of his face, the straight line of his nose, the precise angle of his jaw. And she thought, not for the first time, that Draco Malfoy looked as though he had been designed with the deliberate intent of making his internal state difficult to read. Every feature was a surface that revealed nothing of what moved beneath it, except his hands. She had learned this too, in the patient, accumulative way she had learned everything about him. His face was trained, controlled, available in only the versions he chose to offer. His hands were where the truth leaked out, in the pressure of his grip, in the way his fingers moved when he was thinking, in the whiteness that appeared at his knuckles when something touched a nerve he hadn't sufficiently armored. His hands, resting on his knees, were still, not relaxed, still, the particular stillness of deliberate control. The silver prefect badge on his chest caught the light and released it. Draco. She used his name again, and again felt the small voltage of it, the way it changed the air between them slightly. "Last Saturday, you said you'd tell me what you'd seen. You didn't." The rain. The rain stopped the conversation. It didn't end it. He turned to look at her, the full weight of it, not the corridor-length glance or the peripheral management she usually received. She felt the shift in her chest, the pressure, the closed window feeling, and held it with both hands, metaphorically speaking. "You protected me," he said. It came out with the flatness of something factual, as though he were reciting rather than confessing. "Twice last year that I know of, possibly more. The tracking ward was one. The second, in February, when Umbridge was looking for a reason, any reason, and there was a reason available, and you knew about it, and it disappeared." She said nothing. "You didn't do it because you needed something from me at that point." He said this with the quality of a conclusion reached through considerable resistance. a mathematician writing down a result they had spent weeks trying to disprove. You did it, and then you were as hostile to me as you had always been in any public context. So it wasn't leverage, it wasn't exchange. A pause. I don't understand why. Her thumb found the edge of the textbook's page and pressed into it until she felt the paper's bite. Does it require understanding? For me? Yes. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, not in the way emotions shifted in people who performed them freely. Subtly, the way a very slight change in atmospheric pressure registers in the body before the mind catches up. I've been told my whole life exactly how the world is organized, who belongs where, what things cost, what loyalty looks like and what it doesn't. He stopped, looked at his hands. You don't fit into that. She waited, and I've been trying for 3 years to find the way you fit into that. His voice was still level, still the managed flatness she had learned to read beneath. And I can't. The light from the east window had reached her feet now, moving across the stone floor with its slow morning progress. Below them, the castle was filling with the sounds of the school day beginning. Footsteps in distant corridors, the muffled percussion of a classroom door. The world outside the alcove going about its ordinary business. Inside it, something was happening that did not belong to the ordinary business of the world. She closed the textbook. Draco, she said for the 3rd time, and his name in her mouth had a different quality each time she used it. A slight modulation, as though it were a word in a language she was still learning to pronounce. What you've been trying to do, fitting me into the organization you were given. Have you considered that the organization might be the problem? He looked at her. She held it, did not look away. His jaw set. A muscle moved once along it. His hands on his knees pressed flat, just briefly, just enough. The whitening of his knuckles there and then gone. Something crossed his eyes that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite recognition, but occupied the territory between them, and she felt it land in her own chest with the particular resonance of a sound that has found the frequency of the structure it's moving through. She stood up, collected her books. The moment required movement. She felt this intuitively. Sitting still inside it any longer would be more honesty than either of them was ready to manage. Sunday, she said. Same time. I'll bring the healer's text. We should work through the counter-sequence methodology together. She stepped out of the alcove before he could answer, moving into the corridor's ordinary traffic, her footsteps even and unhurried. She did not look back. She could feel, with the precision of someone whose nerve endings had apparently developed strong opinions on the subject, exactly where he was behind her, not moving yet, still on the bench in the eastern light. Her sleeve cuffs were perfectly straight. She had made sure of it. It cost her this time more than it usually did. Sunday came and she was late. Not genuinely late. She arrived at the alcove with 4 minutes to spare by her watch. But she had intended to be early, had planned to be settled and composed with the healer's text already open before he arrived. And instead, she came around the corner of the charms corridor still pulling her sleeve cuffs straight, with fingers that had apparently decided this morning to have their own agenda entirely. He was already there. This was new. In 3 years of their careful, unacknowledged appointments, she had always arrived first. She had assumed this was structural. She was someone who arrived early to things. He was someone who made a point of arriving precisely when expected, and not a moment before, as though punctuality at its exact limit were a form of dominance. But he was there, on the stone bench, with no book in his hands and no pretense of occupation, simply waiting, which was somehow more disarming than anything she had prepared herself for. He looked up when she came in. Something in the quality of how quickly he looked up told her he had been listening for her footsteps, and this information rearranged something in her chest without her permission. "You're early," she said. "You're late." "I'm 4 minutes early. I've been here for 20. He said it without apparent self-consciousness, which was more unsettling than if he had said it with any. He watched her sit down, not at the far end of the bench this time, she noticed, with the precise neural attention she tried to discourage in herself. She had sat slightly closer, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to mark, but enough, and then looked back at the east window where the morning sky was performing a complicated arrangement of cloud and pale light. She opened the healer's text, set it on the bench between them. He looked at it without reaching for it. "I've been thinking about the counter-sequence methodology," she said, because this was the reason they were here, the stated reason, the one she could maintain eye contact while discussing. The healer outlines 3 phases. The first is diagnostic, mapping the current state of the modification, understanding how thoroughly the original pathways have been rerouted. The second is preparatory, establishing what she calls anchor sequences, specific memories that the modification hasn't touched because they post-date it, which can serve as Granger. She stopped. He was still looking at the window. His hands were on his knees in the careful arrangement she had learned to read. "I've been thinking about what you said Thursday, about the organization being the problem." The sky outside shifted, a break in the cloud cover admitting a brief cold brightness that moved across the alcove floor like a passed hand. "And," she said, "and I've been thinking about it since I was approximately 14 years old," he said, in the level, drained voice of someone reading from an internal document they composed a long time ago and have revisited too many times. "I've just been thinking about it in terms of what to do with the thought, which is the harder problem." She set her thumb against the open page of the text and pressed it flat. "What have you concluded?" A long pause. Outside in the corridor, the distant percussion of the school's morning. Footsteps, voices, someone's familiar laugh fading as they passed. Inside the alcove, the quality of silence was different. The specific density of a space that 2 people are filling with everything they aren't saying. That as some walls, he said carefully, are structural. You remove them and the building falls. He turned his head slightly, not quite toward her, the angle of someone looking at a thing from the edge of their vision, rather than directly. And some walls you think are structural, and you spend years treating as structural, and then one day, something shifts, and you put your hand against it expecting stone, and it moves, and you realize it was never load-bearing at all. It was just placed there by someone else a long time ago. The cold brightness from the window was on his hands. She looked at them in her peripheral, careful way. They were still, not tense, for once. simply still. That's the more frightening discovery, she said quietly. Yes, no hesitation. Because at least when you believe the walls are structural, you know why you can't move. When you discover they weren't. He stopped. The stopped sentence had weight, the kind that dropped straight down. She turned a page of the healer's text without reading it. You have to decide what to do about it yourself. Yes. She looked up at him. He was looking at her now, fully in the direct way that cost her something to hold, the way the full strength of something, light, sound, attention, lands differently on the body than its peripheral version. His expression was not quite any of the things she had catalogued from years of observation. It was newer than those, less finished. As though whatever was usually placed carefully over his face had been set down somewhere else this morning, just for the duration of this conversation. And what remained was something younger and less managed and considerably more difficult to look at without losing the thread of her own composure. "Tell me about your parents," he said. The request was quiet, not a demand. A Malfoy demand had a particular texture, a sense of entitlement baked into the syntax. This was something else. This was an asking. She looked back at the text. "My mother reads," she said after a moment. Not the way I read. She doesn't read to research or to learn. She reads the way some people sleep for the restoration of it. She reads in the kitchen while she's waiting for the kettle, and in the car when my father's driving, and in bed until my father turns the light off and she switches to a torch under the covers. She paused. She used to send me books at school. The Muggle post takes longer than owl post, but she never remembered to use the owl, so I'd get these packages, slightly battered, with her handwriting on the label, and inside would be a book and a note that said something like, "Saw this in the chemist's of all places. Thought of you. Call us when you can." The words were coming without her planning them, which was unusual. She generally planned words. "She doesn't remember sending those," she said. The alcove held the sentence. Draco said nothing. She had noticed over years that he was better at silence than most people, not uncomfortable in it, not inclined to fill it reflexively the way Ron did, or navigate around it the way Harry did. He let silences stand and complete themselves, and this one he let stand for long enough that she felt it settle, the weight of it, the specific grief shape of the thing she had just said. "What does your father do?" he said finally. "Dentist." She looked at him sideways. "He fixes teeth." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Less finished than a smile, more involuntary. Muggles have specialists for that. Muggles have specialists for everything. It's quite efficient. She paused. "He used to do this thing. When I was worried about something, an exam or a social situation or anything really, I tended to catastrophize quite young. He'd sit across from me and ask me to tell him the worst thing that could happen, not to minimize it, just to say it out loud. And then he'd say, 'All right, and what would we do then?' And it never solved anything exactly, but it..." She stopped. "Grounded it," Draco said. "Yes." She looked at him fully, briefly. "Yes, exactly that." He was quiet for a moment. His hands had shifted slightly on his knees, less arranged, more simply resting. "My father," he said, and stopped. Tried again. "My father is very certain about everything. He has never, in my memory, expressed doubt about anything he believes. He presents his version of the world with the completeness of a man who received it whole, without manufacture, without selection, and his primary function in my life has been to ensure I receive the same version with the same completeness. The muscle in his jaw moved once. I was 20 before I questioned whether that certainty was confidence or whether it was something else entirely. "What do you think it is?" she asked. He looked at the window. "I think a man who is genuinely certain doesn't require his son to be certain as well." The cloud shifted again outside, returning the alcove to its ordinary grey morning light. Somewhere in the castle, a bell began its 7-stroke count toward the hour, the sound reaching them in muffled waves through stone and corridor. They had 20 minutes before they would need to be visible elsewhere. "The diagnostic phase," Hermione said, returning to the text with the deliberateness of someone taking hold of a rope, "requires access to the subject. But the healer suggests that preparatory work can be done without direct access, a form of theoretical mapping based on documented parameters of the original modification." She turned to a middle section of the book, a page of dense notation she had already marked in her mind. "I documented everything I did. I know the precise scope and sequence of the charm. I can build the map." He leaned toward the text, slightly, enough to read the page she was showing him. He was close enough now that she could be specifically aware of it. Not uncomfortable, not overwhelming, but present, the way a change in temperature is present when you move from one room to another. The particular warmth of another person at close range. The faint scent of him, something clean with the faint metallic edge of old stone and morning air. "This notation," he said, reaching across and pointing to a line of the healer's calculation, and his hand was 2 inches from hers on the page, "uses a framework I recognize from a text in my father's library. It's a derivative of mnemonic cartography. It's not standard curriculum." He looked up, and they were closer than usual, the geography of both of them leaning toward the book, having reconfigured the space between them without either making a decision about it. "You'd need access to the source text to fully decode this." "Do you have it?" "At home." A pause. "Over the winter holiday." She held his gaze. The implication of the sentence expanded in the space between them like a drop of ink in water, slow, even, impossible to contain once it had started. Over the winter holiday, the Malfoy Manor library, his territory, his house, the physical location of everything about him that was most antithetical to everything she was supposed to represent. "That's a considerable ask," she said carefully. "I know." His voice was level. "I'm asking it anyway." Her heartbeat was doing something she considered professionally inconvenient. She held it, held the whole dense weight of the moment, the old text between them, his hand still near hers on the page, the morning light making its patient progress across the stone floor. The 23 months of careful, constructed distance between them folded into this specific moment, like a letter that had finally been opened. "I'll consider it," she said. It was not a no. He knew it wasn't a no. The slight change in the set of his shoulders told her he knew it. Not satisfaction, not triumph, something quieter. Relief, perhaps, of the complicated kind. The kind that arrives with as much weight as the thing it's relieving. She straightened, moved to close the text. His hand moved at the same moment, and they both reached the cover simultaneously, and for one arrested instant, her hand was over his. Not clasped, not grasping, simply resting, the warmth of contact, the specific reality of skin against old leather, before she pulled it back, cleanly, without comment. She did not straighten her cuffs. She made a point of not straightening them. He closed the book himself and held it out to her. She took it. Their fingers navigated the exchange with precision this time, a careful geography of just not touching that required considerably more attention than touching would have. "Granger," he said as she stood. She looked at him. "My mother will be at the Manor over the holiday." The sentence was arranged with the specific care of something meant to communicate several things at once. "She knows about the library. She can provide context for texts my father didn't explain." A pause. "She's also—" He stopped. Something moved across his face, briefly, the young, unmanaged thing she had seen earlier. "She is not my father." She understood what he was telling her, the layers of it. Not just logistical information about the library and the texts. Something about safety. About the Manor as a place that contained, among its more difficult truths, at least one person who might be navigated towards something other than hostility. "I'll consider it," she said again, but differently this time, with something in her voice that she didn't entirely regulate before it reached the air. She left the alcove. The corridor received her with its ordinary indifference, and she moved through it with steady footsteps and an expression that she assembled carefully, piece by piece, as she walked. Her hand, she noticed, was still warm where it had rested against his. She did not examine this. She carried it the way you carry something fragile when you're not yet sure if you're allowed to put it down, very carefully, without looking at it directly, breathing around it. She told Harry she was going to her parents for the holiday. This was not technically a lie. She had every intention of going to Brisbane. She had been planning it since September, the careful logistics of international portkey travel, the precise emotional preparation required for standing in front of two people who looked at her with warm, generic fondness and did not know her name. She would go to Brisbane. She would sit across from her parents in a kitchen that was not their kitchen and drink tea from mugs that were not their mugs and watch them be happy in the seamless, untroubled way of people who do not know what they are missing. She simply did not mention that she would be stopping at Wiltshire first. Ron accepted her departure with his usual combination of mild guilt about not spending more time with his own family and genuine relief that the holiday meant a pause in academic pressure. Harry hugged her at the station with the particular fierceness of someone who didn't know he was doing it. And she held on for a moment longer than usual because she was allowed to love them. And she did, with the uncomplicated portion of herself that had never been in conflict about anything. The train north, the cold. December pressing itself against the window in shades of pewter and white. She had written to Draco twice since the alcove, both times in the compressed handwriting she had adopted for their correspondence. Small letters, close pressed, as though taking up less space on the page reduced the reality of what was being said. He had written back once, with directions and a time and 2 sentences of practical information, and then, below the practical information, in writing even smaller than usual. My mother knows you're coming. I told her you were helping me with a research project. She asked if you were Hermione Granger, and when I said yes, she was quiet for a moment, and then said to make sure you were given the East guest room because it has the best light for reading. She had read that twice, and then folded it and put it in the interior pocket of her winter coat, which was where she kept things she didn't want to think about directly, but wasn't willing to discard. Malfoy Manor in December. She had constructed it in her imagination from the fragments she had assembled over years. Draco's rare, careful references, the particular quality of restraint that came into his voice when he talked about home, the way he held that word at a slight distance, as though it were a thing he had been given rather than a thing he had chosen. She had imagined it large and cold and deliberate, every surface a statement about the family's position in the architecture of a world she was supposed to be dismantling. She had not imagined the way the frost on its gates caught the December afternoon light and turned it to something that looked, against her better judgment, genuinely beautiful. He met her at the gate himself. She had expected a house elf, or no one, or the particular performance of casual indifference that served him in public spaces. Instead, he was simply there, in a dark coat, his breath visible in the cold air, and he looked at her for a moment with the unguarded quality she had only seen in the alcove, that younger, less managed thing, before his expression settled back into something more composed. "You came," he said. "I said I'd consider it. You said it twice, with different inflections." The ghost of something crossed his face. "I learned to pass your inflections a long time ago." She did not respond to this, because the response that rose immediately was one she had no business offering in the driveway of Malfoy Manor in December with her travelling bag in her hand. He took the bag from her. She let him, which surprised both of them slightly. The inside of the manor was not what she had imagined, and it was exactly what she had imagined, and the dissonance between those two truths occupied her steadily as he led her through high-ceilinged corridors, hung with portraits that watched her with varying degrees of ancestral displeasure. It was large and cold and deliberate. Yes, the architecture made no compromises, every proportion designed for impression rather than comfort. But there were also books everywhere, not in a library, not contained, scattered through the rooms in the specific disorder of things that are actually being read rather than displayed. A stack on a side table with a ribbon marking 3 different places. 2 on a window seat, face down, spines cracked. 1 on the floor beside a chair near the fire in the drawing room they passed, open to a page that someone had been reading recently. She slowed involuntarily. "My mother," Draco said without her asking. "She reads like that," Hermione said, the same open spine disorder. "My mother." He looked at her, said nothing. She looked back at the book on the floor for a moment. A Muggle novel she registered with a start, the spine's typeface unmistakably ordinary, and then followed him up the staircase. Narcissa Malfoy was in the library. Hermione had braced herself for this encounter in the specific way she braced for high-difficulty situations. Thorough preparation, clear objective, emotional state managed to operational levels. She had been prepared for cool assessment, for the particular species of pure-blood scrutiny she had weathered at ministry events and public functions. The look that catalogued and filed and returned its verdict in the slight adjustment of an expression. She had not been prepared for the woman who looked up from a document on the library table with grey eyes that were Draco's eyes, and said, without preamble, "You look tired. Draco, she looks tired. Have you offered her anything? She arrived 4 minutes ago. Then offer her something now." He disappeared with the slightly diminished quality of a person responding to a parent's authority in a space that authority owns. Hermione stood in the library doorway, the actual library, high and panelled and smelling of the specific compound of old leather and dried wood, and the particular dusty sweetness of paper aged past yellow into brown, and looked at Narcissa Malfoy. "Come in," Narcissa said. "The doorway doesn't have the texts you need." She came in. Narcissa was watching her with the precision of someone conducting an assessment they have been anticipating, and under the assessment was something Hermione hadn't expected. Curiosity. Genuine, unguarded curiosity, the kind she recognized because she lived in it herself, the kind that preceded intellectual engagement rather than social calculation. "He's told me nothing, of course," Narcissa said. "He tells me very little. He believes this protects me." She looked at the document in front of her, made a small notation with her quill. "It protects neither of us, but I've allowed him the belief because dismantling it would require a conversation we're not ready for yet." She looked up. "You understand the impulse. You protect people by managing what they know about you." The accuracy of this, delivered so cleanly, took Hermione a moment to absorb. "Sit down, Miss Granger," Narcissa said, not unkindly. She sat. The chair was leather, old and deep, the kind of chair that had been sat in for decades and held the accumulated warmth of it. She put her hands in her lap and looked at Narcissa Malfoy across the library table, and felt, with the peculiar relief of someone who has been performing for a very long time, that performance was not being required of her here. "The healer's text," Narcissa said. "Lydia Voss, 1943. I know the work." She said this simply, without triumph. "My mother had a copy. She was a healer herself before she married. Not many people know that Voss's methodology actually worked. It was suppressed by the Department of Mysteries because it implied that certain legally sanctioned memory modifications could be reversed, which had considerable implications for cases the Ministry preferred remained closed." Hermione's hands pressed flat against her knees. "You've seen it succeed?" "I've seen the theoretical framework proven sound in controlled conditions." Narcissa's gaze was steady. "And I've seen what it costs. The recovery is not clean, Miss Granger. The memories return, but they return like items retrieved from water, present, identifiable, but changed by the medium they passed through. Your parents will remember. They will not remember the forgetting, not exactly. They will have a period that feels, to them, simply absent." She paused. "How long since you performed the modification?" 4 months and 11 days. Something shifted in Narcissa's expression. Not pity. She was not a woman whose face made room for pity as an offered thing. It was too exposed a gesture. Something adjacent to it. Something that knew the same territory from a different angle. "Then you're within the optimal window. The pathways are still proximate, not fully rerouted yet." She heard Draco's footsteps in the corridor outside. "Miss Granger," Narcissa said, and her voice dropped to its more private register. Not quite a whisper, but not public either. the voice of someone saying something in the space between sentences that the record won't show. My son has been different this year. She did not embellish this. She let it stand complete. I am choosing to interpret that as a development rather than a crisis. I want you to know that I am not my husband. Draco came in with tea. The three of them sat in the library as the December afternoon dimmed outside the tall windows, and Narcissa walked them through the supplementary source texts, the mnemonic cartography framework, the additional theoretical work that gave Voss's methodology its fuller context, with the particular teaching quality of someone who learned things in order to pass them on. She was precise and unsentimental, and occasionally, when Hermione raised a counterpoint, genuinely delighted in the way that people who are accustomed to intellectual isolation are delighted by unexpected engagement. Draco sat slightly to Hermione's left and slightly behind, at an angle from which he could see both of them. And he was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was actually attending. Not the managed silence of performance, but the full present stillness of someone taking in more than he was letting show. At one point, Narcissa said something about the counter-sequence timing, and Hermione turned to check it against the text in her hands, and as she turned, she caught the angle of Draco's face in the firelight, the way he was watching his mother with an expression she had never seen on him in 5 years of careful peripheral observation. It was not the compressed apprehension of their school interactions, not the managed neutrality of public corridors. It was something open, something that looked at Narcissa Malfoy with a complexity of feeling that had grief in it, and something that might have been, improbably, hope. He caught her looking. She looked away. From the corner of her eye, she saw the expression close, like a room whose light is suddenly blocked, not hostile, not defensive, simply private, returned to himself. But she had seen it. Dinner was quiet and strange in the way that meals are quiet, and strange when the people sharing them are negotiating, in real time, the terms of a new arrangement. Lucius Malfoy was not present. He was in London, Narcissa mentioned without further elaboration, and the absence had a physical quality in the dining room, the sense of a weight removed, something structural expected to bear that currently wasn't. Hermione ate and spoke carefully, and watched Draco be, in this room with his mother, someone she had only theorized, less armored, not soft. She would never have described him as soft. The word didn't fit the particular quality of him, the way he occupied space with that deliberate precision. But present in a way he wasn't at Hogwarts, less performed. After dinner, Narcissa excused herself with the naturalness of someone creating space with intent, and Hermione and Draco sat in the drawing room by the fire with the healer's text between them and the silence of a house settling into its evening around them. "Your mother is extraordinary," Hermione said. He looked at the fire. "Yes, she loved your father." It came out before she filtered it. Not a question. The evidence had been everywhere in the slight arrangements of the house, the photographs on the mantelpiece, the way Narcissa's eye moved over that particular chair with the book beside it when she thought no one was watching. She still does, I think, despite everything. A long pause. The fire settled, a log shifting, a brief brightness. "That's the thing about love in my family," he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Not the compressed control, not the managed level. Something rawer, the note of something said in genuine tiredness. It doesn't stop when it becomes inconvenient. It doesn't stop when it should, by any rational measure. It just continues, alongside everything else, even when everything else is... He stopped. She looked at him. He was staring at the fire, and she could see in his profile the line of that cost, the jaw, the set of his mouth, the way his hands rested on his knees with that stillness that was not relaxation, but its opposite. Draco, she said, softly this time. His name from her mouth at this register, in this room, was different from the library and the alcove and the tower. It carried something she hadn't put in it before, or rather, something she had stopped removing from it. He turned to look at her. The fire moved between them, its light doing the unrepeatable thing firelight does to a face, finding its angles, making its stillness seem, briefly, like motion. He looked at her, and she looked back, and in the space between them, something that had been static for 3 years moved definitely and irrevocably towards something else. "I'm glad you came," he said. 3 words, plainly arranged. The plainness of them was what reached her, from a person who had spent years selecting words for their surface and their armour. 3 words with no selection in them at all. Just the fact of the thing, offered without arrangement. Her heart did something precise and inconvenient, and she let it. "I'm glad I came too," she said. Outside the manor windows, December was doing what December did, pressing cold and dark and patient against the glass. Inside, the fire burned its ordinary gold. Neither of them moved to end the evening. She left for Brisbane 2 days later. The morning of her departure, Narcissa pressed a folded paper into her hands at the door. Not parchment paper, the muggle kind, which Hermione registered with a small internal adjustment, and said only, "The counter-sequence notations, my own additions to Voss's methodology from the controlled cases I observed. Use them carefully." Then she had looked at Hermione with those grey eyes that were Draco's eyes, and said nothing further, which communicated considerably more than further speech would have. Draco walked her to the gate. They went slowly without discussing the pace through the frost-hardened grounds in the thin December morning light. Their breath made matching clouds in the cold air. She had her travelling bag. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and she was aware, with the heightened attention that these past 2 days had apparently permanently calibrated in her, of the exact distance between his left arm and her right. Not touching, not the negotiated, careful not touching of the alcove, something more natural, the distance of 2 people walking together who are not performing the walking. At the gate, he stopped. She stopped. "How long?" he said. 10 days. I'll be back before term." He nodded, looked at the frost-pale fields beyond the manor wall with the look she had first catalogued in the astronomy tower, the fixed middle distance, the thoughts that had gone somewhere the body couldn't follow. Then he looked at her, and the look was direct and uncurated in the way she had seen twice now, and each time it arrived, it cost her something. This unguarded version, this person who existed in the spaces where the performance had been set aside. "Tell me how it goes," he said. "With your parents." She held his gaze. "I will." A pause, breathing in the cold. Below them, the iron gate with its frost-caught morning light. Beyond it, the lane, the portkey point, the long distance to Brisbane, and two people who didn't know her. Granger. He said her name with a quality she hadn't heard before. Not the flat corridor version, not the alcove version with its careful weight. Something more undefended. Come back. Two words plainly arranged in the way of his three words by the fire. She felt them land with the same precision. I'm coming back, she said. I always come back. She didn't know, saying it, whether she meant from Brisbane or from something larger, from the years of constructed distance, from the long maintenance of a self that left no room for this. He seemed to understand the ambiguity, or perhaps he heard a specific interpretation in it, because something in the set of his shoulders changed slightly, in the way of a breath released. She went through the gate. She did not look back. She had learned, over years, that looking back at certain moments cost more than moving forward, and she needed everything she had for what was coming. Brisbane in December was incomprehensible summer. She stepped out of the Portkey transit point, a wizarding service office near the river, staffed by a witch with a Queensland drawl who handed her a form to sign with the cheerful efficiency of someone for whom intercontinental magical transport was a Tuesday, into heat so complete it was almost tactile. After Wiltshire's frost and the grey Hogwarts winter she had carried in her body for months, the summer air hit her like a physical fact. Bright light, enormous sky, the smell of the river and warm vegetation. Her parents lived 20 minutes by taxi from the transit point. She had their address because she had put them there, had selected the suburb and the street and the specific house with a garden, because her mother had always wanted a garden, and she had reasoned, in the brutal calm of performing the obliviate charm on the two people she loved most in the world, that she could at least give them that small, careful thing, a garden. The taxi moved through Brisbane's summer streets, and she sat in the back with Narcissa's folded notations in her coat pocket, absurdly overdressed, sweating quietly in her English winter layers, and practiced the technique she had developed for managing feelings of overwhelming magnitude. She named them, one by one. Grief, enormous, necessary, guilt, load-bearing, not moving, love, the uncomplicated kind, also enormous, terror. That one was new, not of her parents, not of the conversation, but of the specific possibility that it wouldn't work, that she would sit across from them and perform Narcissa's counter-sequence with all the technical precision she possessed, and it would not be enough, and she would have done this to them for nothing but good intentions, which was perhaps the worst thing you could do something for. The house had a garden. Of course it did. She had chosen it. But she hadn't been prepared for the specific garden it had become in her parents' occupancy, the evidence of Monica Wilkins's attention to it, the roses along the front fence in bloom, because December in Brisbane was summer, fat and fully open in pink and cream. Her mother had always wanted roses, had said so once when Hermione was 8 and they were driving past a house with a rose hedge, casually, the kind of remark you make and forget making. But Hermione had filed it. She stood on the pavement outside the gate for a moment, just standing, looking at the roses her mother had grown without knowing they were a wish she'd always had. Then she opened the gate. Her mother answered the door. Jean Granger. Monica Wilkins, her mind supplied, correcting itself with the dreary discipline of someone who has had to perform a correction too many times, was in a summer dress and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she looked at Hermione with the warm, slightly distracted expression she gave to unexpected visitors. Pleasant, but without the specific frequency of recognition, the deep tuning fork of a mother seeing her child. "Hello," John said. "Can I help you?" Hermione had known this would happen. She had prepared for this. She had rehearsed this precise moment in the library at Hogwarts at 2 a.m. on multiple occasions, had coached herself through it with all the clinical efficiency at her disposal, had told herself the absence of recognition was temporary and structural rather than real. A door with no handle yet, rather than an empty room. "My name is Hermione," she said. "I'm doing a survey for the university about dental practices in the area." This was the cover the ministry's relocation team had established, and she hated it with a specificity she generally reserved for incomplete theoretical frameworks. "Your practice was recommended by several neighbours." Her mother smiled. That smile, the particular warmth of it beginning in the chest rather than the throat, and said, "Of course, come in. Would she like tea?" She came in. For 3 days, she was a dental survey researcher named Hermione. She sat in their kitchen and drank tea from mugs that were not her parents' mugs. She had bought those mugs. She remembered buying them at a charity shop in Hobart on a research trip for the relocation, choosing ones that looked as though they might have always belonged, and talked to her parents with the disciplined warmth of someone performing a role while simultaneously conducting the most precise and devastating observation of her life. She mapped them. Not coldly. It was not cold. None of it was cold. She cried in the east-facing guest bedroom every night, with a pillow held over her face so no one would hear. Cried with the specific racking quality of someone whose composure has held for too long, and finally, in private, exceeds its load-bearing capacity. But she mapped them with the attention Narcissa's methodology required. The current state of the modification, the pathways present and dormant, the specific signature of Monica and Wendell Wilkins laid over the truer signatures below. Her father shook her hand on the first day with the broad, careful hands she remembered, and the physical reality of that. Her hand in her father's hand, his grip unconsciously gentle in the way of a man who worked with precision, cost her so much composure that she had to look away and study the kitchen window with extreme interest until she could breathe normally. Her mother recommended a book to her on the second day across the kitchen table with the same unself-conscious warmth she had always brought to book-giving. The same gesture. Reaching across to where the book was sitting, pressing it into Hermione's hands, saying, "I don't know why, but I think you'd love this." She took the book, held it against her chest the way she had held the healer's text against her chest in the astronomy tower months ago, as though the object were a thing that breathed, that required careful handling, that contained something alive. On the third evening, with Narcissa's notations spread on the guest bed, and the healer's text open beside them, and the Brisbane summer pressing warm and alive against the window, she made her decision. She was going to attempt the first phase of the counter-sequence, not the full reversal. She was not qualified to perform the full reversal alone. Not yet. Not without additional resources she hadn't assembled. But the diagnostic phase, the mapping, The careful preliminary work that would establish whether the pathways were sufficiently proximate for the full sequence to hold. If she could establish that, she could come back. She could do this properly. She could bring the right help. Narcissa, perhaps, whose knowledge of the practical application was genuine and whose motivations she had assessed over 2 days in a manor library as something she was prepared to provisionally trust. She lay on the guest bed with the notations in her hands and looked at the ceiling and thought about Draco saying, "Come back in the frost outside the manor gate," with that undefended quality in his voice. She thought about the fact that he had looked for a way to help her parents before she had asked him to, had found Voss's text and read it, and brought it to a meeting in the astronomy tower in the rain, and had said with the flatness of something factual, "I'll bring the text." She thought about his mother's grey eyes pressing muggle paper into her hands at the door and saying, "Use them carefully." She thought about all the walls she had placed around herself, the structural and the non-structural, and how she had spent years unable to tell the difference, and how the difference was beginning to feel, from inside the current moment, extremely significant. She performed the diagnostic on the 4th day. She waited until her parents had gone out. Her father had a golf commitment on Saturday mornings. Her mother gardened and sat at the kitchen table with her wand and Narcissa's notations and 3 hours of concentrated, terrifying work. The diagnostic did not restore anything. It was not designed to. It was designed to look carefully and precisely at what was present under the modification, to send a thread of deliberate magical attention through the rerouted pathways and return with information about their current state. What it returned made her sit very still at the kitchen table for a long time. The pathways were proximate, more proximate than Narcissa had expected at 4 months, more proximate than the standard literature would predict. Whoever her parents were at the deepest structural level, the people who had chosen her name and taught her to read and sent books in the post with notes that said, "Thought of you, call us when you can," those people were not gone. They were present, intact, held in the structure of the modification like letters in a room with no doors. She could make the door, not today, not alone, but she could make it. She sat in the Brisbane summer kitchen with her wand on the table and the diagnostic results held in her mind with the careful precision of someone cradling something that must not be dropped, and felt, in the taxonomy she had developed for managing herself, something that would not stay inside its category, not hope anymore, not the jagged-edged thing that lived under her sternum, something cleaner than that, something with more oxygen in it, something that expanded rather than contracted. She let herself feel it for exactly 4 minutes. She counted. Then she picked up a quill, pulled a sheet of paper toward her. Muggle paper, her mother's stationery, with a small printed rose in the corner that she could not look at directly without the composure issue returning, and wrote. It worked. The diagnostic was successful. The pathways are intact. I'll explain when I'm back. There's more to do, but it's possible. It's actually possible. She looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then, below it, without planning to, she wrote, "Thank you for finding the text." She folded it. She would not send it from Brisbane, the ministry-monitored international owl post, and she was not supposed to be here for anything other than a family visit. She would carry it back with her and send it from Hogsmeade. But she had written it, and the writing of it was its own thing, separate from the sending. An acknowledgement, a reaching towards something she had been moving toward for 3 years, and had only recently, in a frost-cold driveway with a December light on his face and 2 words plain and undefended in the cold air, stopped pretending she wasn't moving toward. Come back. She was coming back. Outside the kitchen window, her mother was in the garden with her hands in the soil, kneeling beside the roses she had grown from a wish she didn't remember having, her face entirely untroubled in the Saturday morning light. Hermione watched her for a long time. Then she folded the letter, pressed it flat against the table, and began to plan. She sent the letter from Hogsmeade on the 2nd of January. The owl she hired from the post office, a brisk professional barn owl with the demeanour of someone who considered emotional letters beneath their logistical capabilities, took the folded paper from her hands and departed without ceremony into the grey New Year sky. And she stood outside the post office in the cold, with her hands in her coat pockets, and watched it go until it was a speck, and then nothing. And then she walked back to Hogwarts along the frozen road with the particular internal quality of someone who has set a stone rolling down a hill and is now watching the hill. Term did not start for 4 more days. The castle was still in its holiday quiet, reduced population, reduced noise, the corridors holding their own echo back rather than dispersing it into the ordinary crowd. She liked Hogwarts in this state, had always liked it, the way it became more itself when fewer people were performing their versions of inhabiting it. The stones more present, the magic in the walls more audible if you had the attention for it. A low, tidal quality, old and indifferent, and somehow deeply reassuring. She went to the library. Of course she went to the library. She spent the afternoon working through the supplementary texts Narcissa had indicated, cross-referencing the mnemonic cartography framework against the diagnostic results she had carried home from Brisbane in careful, detailed notes. The work was absorbing in the way that genuinely difficult problems were absorbing, the kind that required the full width of your attention and left no room for the ambient noise of everything else. She sat in the dying afternoon light with ink on her fingers and 3 books open simultaneously, and felt, for the first time in months, something approaching equilibrium. His reply came the next morning. She was at breakfast, the great hall sparse with holiday population, a scattered handful of students at each table, the staff end more populated than usual, when the barn owl reappeared with the economical efficiency of a professional and deposited a folded note beside her porridge with the air of someone completing a contracted obligation and not a moment more. She waited until it had gone before she opened it. The handwriting was compressed, as always, but something in its arrangement was different from their usual correspondence. The letters less rigidly controlled, slightly more open, as though the hand that wrote them had been less supervised than usual. I knew it would work. You're the most technically precise person I've ever encountered, and that includes several people who have made precision their life's vocation. If the diagnostic found intact pathways, it's because they're there, and because you looked for them correctly. A pause in the writing, visible in the ink. a place where the quill had been lifted and replaced, suggesting a gap between sentences that was longer than the sentences themselves. "I've been thinking about what you said in the driveway, about coming back. I've been thinking about it with a frequency that I'm choosing not to quantify." Another lifted quill pause. "My mother asked about you twice over the remaining holiday. I told her you were well. She said to tell you the East guest room is available whenever you need the library again." I don't think she was talking about the library. She read the note 3 times. Then she folded it with hands that were performing steadiness in a way that was becoming increasingly effortful, placed it in her interior coat pocket alongside the letter she'd written in Brisbane that she had decided to keep rather than send, and returned to her porridge. Across the hall, at the Slytherin table, there was no one she was looking for. He was still at the Manor. She would not see him until term started. This was fine. This was appropriate. She had 4 days and excellent research to occupy her, and she was, by any reasonable measure, entirely in control of herself. She ate her porridge and straightened her sleeve cuffs, and was entirely in control of herself. He came back on the 5th of January. She knew this, not because she saw him arrive, but because she felt the castle change. Some atmospheric recalibration, a shift in the pressure of the air in the East Wing corridors that she would have dismissed as imagination if she had a better relationship with self-deception. She was in the Charms corridor when it happened, carrying books back from the library in the last of the afternoon light, and she stopped walking for a moment without entirely knowing why. Then she heard footsteps coming around the corner, precise, unhurried, the specific pattern she had learned years ago without meaning to. And he was there. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. The corridor held the arrested quality of a pendulum at the top of its arc. He looked different in the way people look different after you have seen them in their home, in the context that formed them, stripped of the institutional surface that school places over everyone. Not unfamiliar, more specifically, himself. The precise geometry of his face, the careful arrangement of his posture, all of it legible to her now in the fuller way of something she had the complete text of rather than isolated passages. "You're back," she said. "So are you." He looked at her with the unguarded quality she had come to understand was available only in the absence of audience. The corridor was empty. The late afternoon light came through the window at the far end and reached them at an angle that made the stone walls look almost warm. How were they? 2 words, carrying more weight than their surface. She understood what he was asking. Not just the trip, not just the logistics. How were they? How were you? How does it feel to stand in front of the thing you did and see it clearly? "My mother recommended a book to me," she said. Across the kitchen table, without knowing she was doing it. She paused. It was the most painful thing I have ever experienced, and also, somehow, the most hopeful. His eyes did not leave her face. "The diagnostic worked," she continued. "Exactly as Narcissa predicted. The pathways are intact. The full counter-sequence is possible." She shifted the books against her chest. "I need the source texts from your father's library, the ones Narcissa identified, and I need her to be present for the full reversal. Her practical experience is not something I can replicate from theoretical reading alone." "I know," he said. "I spoke to her before I left. She's agreed." She absorbed this. He had spoken to his mother before leaving the manor, before she had even sent the letter from Hogsmeade about being present for the full sequence. He had anticipated this and arranged it without being asked. In the quiet way she had come to understand was how he did things. Without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement, simply addressing the problem with the same practicality with which he had found Voss's text in the first place. Something in the region of her sternum did what it had been doing with increasing frequency for the past several weeks. Draco, she did, and the quality of his name from her in the empty corridor in this particular late afternoon light was different again. A new entry in the lexicon of it, one she hadn't used before. He went very still. Thank you, not just for the texts and Narcissa, for all of it, the original research, the note in the rain, all of it. He looked at her with the young, unmanaged expression, the one that appeared when the performance had been genuinely set down, not strategically, but involuntarily. It lasted several seconds, which was longer than it ever had before. Then something shifted in it. Something moved through the openness of it, a shadow, a complication, the not quite anger that she had catalogued as apprehension. His jaw set. He looked away at the corridor wall, which was where he looked when he was thinking something he hadn't yet decided whether to say. "There's something you should know," he said. The air in the corridor changed. She felt it, the atmospheric pressure of something arriving, something that had been approaching for a while and had now reached the moment of arrival. "The tracking ward," he said. "The one you gave me the counter sequence for, in 5th year." She waited. "I told you I didn't use it against you." He was still looking at the wall. His hands were at his sides, and she could see, in her careful peripheral attention, the pressure building in them, the slow whitening at his knuckles. "That was true. I didn't use it against you." A pause, built from something that cost him. "I used the information, not against you specifically, but I used it, I passed it on as part of a larger report to people I was reporting to at that time, and I removed your name from it. I was careful about that. I made sure it couldn't be traced to you. But the information itself..." He stopped. She looked at the side of his face. "I was 15, he said, and there was nothing defensive in it, no request for mitigation. The sentence had the quality of evidence submitted rather than excuse offered. I was 15, and I had been told my entire life what my obligations were, and I hadn't yet reached the point of questioning them with anything more than private doubt. And I told myself removing your name was sufficient." His jaw moved once. "It wasn't sufficient." The corridor was very quiet. Outside, the January dark was coming early, pressing against the windows. She was aware of several things simultaneously. The fact of what he had told her, the fact that he had told her, which was its own separate and significant fact, and the thing she was doing internally with both of these facts, which was not the clean, categorical response that the organized part of her would have preferred. "Did anyone get hurt?" she said carefully, "from the information?" He was quiet for a moment. "No, not directly. The report was filed, and I don't know what became of it. That was the nature of the reports. You submitted them, and they disappeared into something larger, and you didn't ask what happened after." He finally looked at her. The grey of his eyes had the winter water quality, something that moved if you looked at it long enough. I've thought about it for 2 years. Every time you gave me something, every time you trusted me with something, I thought about it. She looked at him steadily. This was not easy. Her chest was doing something complex, and she let it. And she looked at him steadily and thought about 15 and obligations pressed into a person before they had the architecture to evaluate them, and the difference between what someone does and what they do when they know better. She thought about herself at 11 under the sorting hat, accepting the assignment of a self that would serve a purpose she was only beginning to understand. "You removed my name," she said. "Yes." At 15, in a context where removing it cost you something, and no one would have known whether you had or hadn't. He said nothing. He was waiting for the verdict, and the waiting had a quality that she understood was not easy for him. Draco Malfoy did not submit to judgment without considerable private cost. "That matters," she said. He looked at her. "Not because it fixes it," she said carefully. "It doesn't fix it, and I'm not going to tell you it does, because you don't want me to tell you it does, and I don't say things I don't believe." She kept her voice level, not cold, level, which was different, which had warmth in it that was not performing warmth. "But it matters, and you telling me matters. And the 2 years of thinking about it while accepting things I gave you, knowing I didn't know, that matters too, in its own way." Something happened in his expression that she didn't have a catalogued name for. She had been cataloguing his expressions for 3 years, and this one was new. It had grief in it, and something that was not quite relief, and something beneath both of those that was the most undefended thing she had ever seen on his face. He looked away before she could map it completely. She gave him the moment. She turned and looked at the corridor window, at the January dark pressing against the glass, at her own faint reflection in it, and his slightly behind and to the left, the two of them rendered in the dim transparency of reflected winter light. "The summer," she said, to her own reflection, to the corridor. "After the war is over, however it ends, I need to go back to Brisbane with Narcissa's full counter-sequence. I need my parents to know me again." "Yes," he said, "I want you to come." The silence that followed had a different density from the silences that had preceded it. She felt it in her chest. She kept looking at her reflection, at his slightly behind hers, and waited. Granger. His voice, at this register, in this empty corridor with the dark outside, and the two of them in the glass, had the quality of something said without the final layer of management removed, the very last one, the one closest to the actual person. "I've been trying to tell you something for approximately 3 years, and I have consistently failed to find an arrangement of words that—" "Then don't use words," she said. She turned around. He was closer than she had realized. The corridor's intimacy, the dark outside, some ambient recalibration of the space between them that had happened while she was looking at the window. Close enough that she could see the specific grey of his eyes in the low torchlight. Not pewter, not winter water, something more present than either of those, something that was simply and specifically him, looking at her with the full unguarded weight of 3 years of accumulated private attention. His hand came up, not quickly, not with certainty, with the slow deliberateness of someone making a decision in real time, crossing a threshold they are fully aware of crossing. His fingers found the line of her jaw, barely contact, the minimal pressure of a touch that was asking rather than telling. She let it. His thumb moved once along her cheekbone, and she felt the cold of his ring against her skin. Silver, she knew without looking, the bite of it specific and real, and the warmth of his hand against the contrast of it. And she stood in the torchlit corridor with her books against her chest and her heart doing its inconvenient, precise thing, and looked at him and understood that this moment was both entirely unexpected and the least surprising thing that had ever happened to her. "Draco," she said very quietly. "I know," he said, equally quiet. Neither of them moved for a moment that had no measured length, the corridor holding them in its particular silence, the January dark at the windows, the castle's old walls present around them with their accumulated weight of centuries and magic, and everything that had ever been felt inside them by people who did not think posterity would notice. Then she closed the remaining distance. Not him. Her. The last step was hers, deliberate and unambiguous, and when her forehead came to rest against his, she felt the breath go out of him, as though something that had been held for a very long time had finally been allowed to release. His other hand came to her waist, steady and careful and entirely real. They stood like that, foreheads together, breathing. Outside, the January dark. Inside, the fire of something that had been burning underground for 3 years, finally, quietly, reaching the surface. The war ended in May. Not cleanly. Nothing about it was clean. Nothing about the final weeks of it bore any resemblance to the neat resolution that the word ended implied. It was loud and irreversible, and it took things that could not be returned. And when the silence came, it arrived with the exhausted completeness of something that had consumed everything available to it, and simply stopped. Hermione stood in the great hall in the early morning after, and looked at the sky through the enchanted ceiling. Ordinary sky, the particular pale blue of a May dawn that had no knowledge of what had occurred beneath it, and felt the specific weight of survival, which was not the same as victory, which was heavier and more complicated, and required considerably more of a person than the moment of winning. She had a cut along her left forearm that someone had healed imperfectly in the chaos and would scar. She had ash in her hair. She had been awake for 31 hours, and her hands were shaking with a fine tremor that she observed with clinical detachment as she held them in front of her, watching the movement. She was looking for him. She had been looking for him in the controlled, peripheral way she had practiced for years. Not obviously, not at the expense of her attention to the people immediately around her, but steadily, the low-frequency search that had become, over the past 5 months, as habitual as breathing. She had last seen him 3 hours ago, during the worst of it, in a corridor she would not be able to walk through again without the memory operating over the reality like a double exposure. He had been standing between her and something she would not name yet, and he had looked at her across the distance with that unguarded, grey-eyed look that was the most private thing he owned. And then the chaos had moved between them like a tide, and she had lost him. She found him outside. He was sitting on the steps at the entrance to the castle, his back against the stone. his legs stretched out before him, looking at the grounds with the exhausted stillness of someone who has used everything they had and arrived empty at the other side. His robes were dark at the shoulder with something she didn't investigate. His hair was entirely undone, the careful arrangement abandoned in the night's extremity, and he looked younger for it, or perhaps simply more real, the surface worn through to the actual person. She sat down beside him on the steps. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. They sat in the May dawn with their shoulders 3 inches apart and looked at the grounds together, the damaged grounds, the evidence of what had passed through them. And the silence they sat in was not empty, but full, dense with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said, and the particular quality of 2 people who have come through something and arrived against the various probabilities at the same place on the other side. His hand, resting on the stone beside him, moved 1 inch toward hers. She moved hers 1 inch toward his. Their fingers did not quite touch. The cold of the stone step between their palms, the inch of space, present and deliberate. "You're bleeding," he said, not looking. "I know. Someone healed it badly." "Let me." She held out her arm. He took it with both hands, the specific, careful grip of someone handling something they consider significant, and bent his head over the cut on her forearm. And she felt the warmth of the healing charm move through the skin with the precision of someone who had learned the spell from a source that actually understood it. His thumbs rested on either side of the cut while he worked, light pressure, entirely steady. And she looked at the top of his bent head in the May morning light and felt something in her chest that was not one of the named clinical categories, something that required new vocabulary. "There," he said, not releasing her arm. She looked at the healed skin. Clean, no scar, better than any of the field healing she'd received through the night. "Thank you," she said. He looked up at her then, from the angle of having her arm in his hands, and the grey of his eyes in the early light was something she still didn't have the final word for. Something forged and also soft, the paradox of him that she had spent years cataloguing and still couldn't compress into a single description. He looked tired. He looked, underneath the tiredness, like someone who had made decisions in the night and was now, in the morning, sitting with their full weight. He had made decisions in the night. She had seen one of them in the corridor when he had stood between her and something she was not ready to name. He still had her arm. She was aware of this with the complete attention she had stopped pretending was peripheral. "Draco," she said. "I know," he said, which was what he had said in the January corridor, foreheads together in the torchlight. The same words, 5 months and a war later, carrying the same frequency. The frequency of 2 people who have passed the point of requiring the sentence completed because the sentence had been living, half-spoken, in the air between them for long enough that they both knew its shape entirely. She turned her hand over in his, palm up. He looked at it for a moment, then at her, and then his fingers closed around hers with the unhurried deliberateness of someone arriving somewhere they had been travelling toward for a very long time. She looked at the grounds. He looked at the grounds. The May dawn moved across the grass with its indifferent beauty, and the castle breathed around them with its old stone patience, and the world made its slow beginning of the day after. Brisbane in August was still warm, though the worst of the summer heat had passed. Narcissa arrived by international portkey on a Tuesday with a travelling case and the particular composed efficiency of a woman who has decided to do something and has consequently done it. And she shook Hermione's hand at the transit office with the grey eyes and the thing inside them that was not pity, but knew the same territory from another angle, and said, "Are you ready?" "No," Hermione said. "Yes, both." "That's the correct answer," Narcissa said, and picked up her case. Draco was already outside. He had arrived the previous day, ahead of Narcissa, in the way of someone who had thought carefully about what would be needed, and had decided that what would be needed was someone already present. He was standing in the Brisbane August warmth, looking faintly displaced by the climate, his English pallor unsuited to the subtropical light, his coat entirely wrong for the temperature. And when she came out of the transit office and saw him, she felt the specific warmth of his presence, not just physically, not just the fact of him in the light, but the accumulated weight of what he represented in this moment. The text in the rain, the letter about her parents, the frost-pale driveway, the January corridor, the May steps, all of it compressed into the fact of him standing in the wrong coat in Brisbane on the day she was going to try to give her parents back to themselves. "You're too warm," she said. "I'm fine." "You look like you're considering removing your coat." "I am considering it. I'm just not doing it yet." He looked at her, the unguarded look available now in more circumstances than it had once been. Not fully public yet, not in school corridors or ministry functions, but in the spaces that were theirs, the private geography they had accumulated. "How are you?" "No," she said. "Both." He understood this immediately, which was one of the things about him that she had stopped cataloguing as surprising and had simply incorporated as a fact of her life. He nodded, said nothing further. This was the correct response, and he knew it. Narcissa appeared behind her and said they should go, and they went. Her parents were in the garden. This was not planned. She had not known they would be in the garden when they arrived, had not staged it, had simply knocked at the gate at 11 in the morning and found them both there. Her father with pruning shears, looking pleasantly bewildered at the roses. Her mother on her knees in the soil with her gardening gloves, and the reading glasses pushed up on her head, that she always pushed up on her head when she wasn't reading, which was often. Jean Granger looked up at the three of them with a warm, distracted expression Hermione knew and had been carrying in her chest for a year. "Hello," Jean said. "Can I help?" She stopped. The stopping was not dramatic. It was a very small pause, a fraction of a second, the length of a skipped heartbeat. Her expression didn't change completely. It shifted, the way a room shifts when someone opens a curtain, and the quality of the light alters without the room becoming an entirely different room. "Jean," Narcissa said, with the specific authority of a woman who has spent her life operating in high-stakes situations and has developed a voice for them. Not commanding, not aggressive, simply completely present. "My name is Narcissa. I wrote to you." She had written to them. This had been Narcissa's protocol. A letter, carefully worded the week before, establishing the visit with enough of the truth to prepare them, and not enough to overwhelm before the work was done. John and Wendell Wilkins had written back with the polite confusion of people who had received an unusual letter and decided, on balance, to treat it as legitimate. Wendell came around the rose hedge with his pruning shears and looked at the three of them with the broad, careful face that Hermione had memorized before she had known what memorizing it would cost. Narcissa stepped forward. She spoke to them quietly. Hermione couldn't hear all of it, was not meant to hear all of it, stepped back with Draco to the gate while the conversation happened on the garden path. She looked at the roses instead, the pink and cream of them, fat and open, the wish her mother had grown without knowing it was her wish. She felt Draco's hand find hers. She did not look at him. She held his hand and looked at the roses and breathed. The counter sequence took 2 hours. It was not performed in the garden. They moved inside, to the kitchen, to the table where Hermione had drunk tea in someone else's mugs and talked about dentistry with strangers. And Narcissa worked with the precision of someone who has prepared for decades. And Hermione sat across the table and held the diagnostic map she had built in her memory and supplied the specific parameters Narcissa required. And Draco sat in the doorway of the kitchen because inside felt like something he should not intrude upon. But the doorway was somewhere he could remain. And this, Hermione thought, watching him in the corner of her vision, was exactly right. Present without intruding, available without requiring. She heard her mother make a sound, not a word, not yet. A sound, small and surprised and confused, the sound of a person inside whom something has just moved that hasn't moved in a long time. Like the first functioning of a joint that has been locked, the moment before pain and after stillness. Jean Granger looked across the kitchen table at her daughter. For a long moment, neither of them breathed. "Hermione," her mother said. Not a question, a recognition. The specific frequency of it, beginning in the chest rather than the throat, the warmth of it, the particular way her name sounded in the mouth of the person who had chosen it. Hermione's composure lasted approximately 2 seconds. She crossed the kitchen in the time it took the sound of her name to fully reach her, and her mother's arms came up and around her with the automatic completeness of something the body remembers without instruction. And she pressed her face against her mother's shoulder and felt the specific warmth and weight of it, the cotton of her mother's shirt, the smell of garden soil, and the same soap from her whole childhood, and cried with the racking, relieved, entirely undignified quality of someone whose composure has just been granted permission to stop. Her father's hand, broad and careful, came to rest on her back. She did not try to manage any of it. She held it, and it held her. And outside the kitchen window, the Brisbane August moved through its warmth and light and ordinary beauty, entirely unconcerned. Later, much later, when her parents were sitting at the kitchen table with Narcissa, working through the gaps in their memory, the absent year, the things that required patient reconstruction. Hermione found Draco in the back garden. He was standing near the roses. He had finally removed his coat, which was over his arm, and was looking at the garden with the middle-distance expression she had first catalogued in the library when he was 14, and she had turned a corner and found him on the floor not reading. the expression that meant his thoughts had gone somewhere the body couldn't follow. She came and stood beside him. The afternoon light came across the garden at its late-day angle, low and specific, the kind of light that makes ordinary things visible in an altered way. The roses casting long, thin shadows across the grass, the fence posts defined with sudden clarity, the air itself seeming to have more dimension than it did at noon. "She said my name," Hermione said. He turned to look at her. She looked back. "I know," he said. "I heard." She looked at him in the Brisbane afternoon, the English pallor suited to this light as it happened, the sharp, familiar geometry of his face, the grey eyes with their winter water quality that she had been reading for years and was still, she suspected, not finished learning. He looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of it, the thing he had spent years placing carefully over, and that now, in the gardens and libraries and corridors and dawns they had moved through together, lived increasingly near the surface. "Thank you," she said, "for being here." "There is nowhere else I would be," he said, plainly arranged in the way he said the things he meant most. No selection, no armor, just the fact of it. She reached up and straightened his collar, which had turned under at one side in the removal of the coat. Her hands rested against his chest for a moment after, the warmth of him through the fabric, the steady reality of him standing in her parents' garden in the Brisbane August light, present and specific, and entirely, irrevocably here. He set his coat down on the garden bench. His hands came to her face with the unhurried deliberateness she had learned, the slow decision made in real time, fully aware of the threshold. His thumbs at her cheekbones, the familiar cold bite of the silver ring and the warmth around it, and he looked at her with all 3 years, and the war and the frost-pale driveway and the astronomy tower rain, and every library and alcove and corridor and dawn held in the quality of it. She looked back with everything she had. Then he kissed her, not urgently, not with the compressed energy of something long denied finally released. Slowly, in the way of something that has always been available and has simply been waiting with enormous patience for the right moment to arrive. His mouth on hers was warm and deliberate and entirely certain, and she felt it in the full width of herself, not just the tactile reality of it, but the accumulated meaning of it, the long travel of it, everything it had taken to arrive here, in this garden, in this light, with his hands on her face, and the roses behind her casting their long, late shadows. She kissed him back. Her hands found the front of his shirt, and she held on, and the garden held them, and the light moved across the grass with its slow, indifferent beauty. And inside the kitchen, her mother was learning the shape of a year she had lost, and her father's careful hands were holding a cup of tea, and the world was not fixed, not clean, not without its necessary grief, but present and real and going forward. Above them, the Brisbane sky did what skies do. It held everything beneath it with its enormous, uncomplicated blue. Neither of them moved to end the kiss. There was no reason to.
Історія 7, клімакс, дубль 1, Союз називається. This story started with one question. What if Hermione was never fully on one side? Not because she was all bad, but because the heart doesn't follow rules. It doesn't care about houses or blood status or which side of the war you were born into. Hermione loved Harry and Ron, that was real, but she also carried something else, something quieter, something she never said out loud. Draco was not a good person at the start. He made wrong choices, he hurt people, he knew it, but he also removed her name from a report at 15, when no one was watching. That small thing mattered. This story is not about enemies becoming strangers. It is about two people who were always paying attention to each other, even when they pretended not to. The parent storyline was important to me because Hermione made a sacrifice no one fully saw. She erased herself from the memory of the two people who loved her most. That kind of loneliness needed a witness. Draco became that witness, and Narcissa, she was never just a side character here. She was the bridge, the proof that people inside difficult families can still choose something better. The kiss in the garden and the end. It was not the climax, it was the rest. After everything, after the war, after the rain and the frost and the long years of almost. Thank you for listening to this story. Some loves are loud, this one was pushing.